In 1932, Dr. Ferdinand Porsche began working on designs for a simple, economical, reliable car that could be easily mass-produced. Interrupted by military machinery designs, the production of the Volkswagen for the general public was delayed until 1945. Few but highly successful vehicles produced at a plant in Wolfsburg, Germany, enabled Dr. Porsche to begin his family-owned business by 1949. In Stuttgart, less than 300 handcrafted sports cars based on Volkswagen component designs were manufactured. The Porsche automobile gained a reputation for the same reliability and economy based on simplicity, but with the added virtues of speed and handling. In the mid-1950s, there was a growing demand for the 356 model production cars. Porsche engineers were looking toward the future and began designing the 901 or 911 series as early as 1956. More than 25 years later, this refined Porsche is still as popular and as exciting as ever. Before starting the tune-up, here are some safety tips. Wear safety goggles around the battery and when cutting, drilling, or prying. Use safety stands when working under the car. Do not let the car rest on the jack. Block the wheels when the car is raised or when the engine is running. Disconnect the battery when working on the electrical system. Use the proper tools for the job you are performing. Don't run the engine unless the garage is well ventilated. Don't wear loose clothing. The air cooling fan acts like a vacuum and extra care should be taken. Don't smoke around gasoline or other flammable materials. Use common sense. Don't hurry. Do the job properly. Here are some tools you'll need. Screwdrivers of both types, slotted and Phillips head. A pair of pliers. A set of open-end wrenches. A set of sockets with extensions. You may only need a few sizes, but a complete set will come in handy. A set of feeler gauges, a torque wrench, spark plug socket, and safety glasses. A spark plug gapping tool. A grease gun. A strobe-type timing light. A spanner wrench. A valve adjusting feeler gauge. A set of Allen keys. And a dwell meter. Here are the parts you'll need. Spark plugs of the proper type. If required, a set of ignition points. A distributor cap and rotor. An air filter. A full set of 4 valve cover gaskets. A fan belt. Oil and oil spout. An oil filter. And grease. In order to clearly view the 911 engine, we've mounted one on an engine stand. Please note that some procedures used may be more difficult. The use of a shop work manual may come in handy, and most important, be patient. For your convenience, we've incorporated an easy-to-follow index system displayed by numbers in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. Scan the proper category by noting the index number. See the enclosed pamphlet. Locate first the exhaust muffler. Next, the cooling fan and belt, which draw and force fresh air across the entire motor. The fuel system filter box or air box containing the air filter. Directly behind the air box is the air bellows. We will describe its function in further detail in Section 7. This is one of 6 fuel injector nozzles. It is seated in the cylinder head directly over each intake valve. We have removed it to show the rubber O-ring seal, which is subject to wear and is important to overall performance. Do not attempt to remove the injector. Simply hold the top of the nozzle and see if it is firmly seated. Movement may indicate seal wear or deterioration, allowing air to be drawn in. The ignition system is of the capacitive discharge type. The coil only acts as a transformer, stepping up current to the distributor, which in this engine is of the conventional type for a 6-cylinder engine. Note the coil. The distributor cap, which simply snaps into place, and the high-tension leads, or wires, are always subject to deterioration and wear. They are easily replaced. The vacuum diaphragm and hose attached is responsible for timing the spark during changes in engine speed. An air leak can drastically alter performance. Next, notice the location of the temperature sending sensor. The spark plugs with the high-tension leads, 3 on each side, aren't as easy to see or reach with the engine in the car. Next, notice the fuel pressure regulator, which maintains equal pressure throughout the pressurized side of the fuel system. Now locate the intake pipe or manifolds, 3 per side, which supply air to each cylinder. The deceleration valve acts to momentarily hold the throttle from shutting or snapping closed. The throttle return spring must be attached to the throttle linkage at all times. We will describe its function later. The air screw or idle speed adjusting screw acts as an air bypass, thus raising or lowering engine speed. Underneath the car you will find both heat exchangers. They capture heat, providing fresh hot air to the interior. Above each heater box are the exhaust valve covers. On the right side, the lower oil cooler line to the tank and the upper line to the crankcase are visible. The upper intake valve covers are accessible from under the engine lid. Finally, the uppermost components are again the air bellows and beneath it, the fuel distributor. From behind the car, locate the oil pressure sending unit, which transmits variable electrical resistance to the gauge. Below it is the pressure warning switch. These wire leads are often found loose or broken, giving false readings. Also, check for oil leakage. On the left side of the engine compartment is located a small but important fuse box. Various removable relays, the tachometer transducer unit, the voltage regulator, and behind it, the capacitive discharge amplifier unit. Above and behind is the fuel accumulator and the fuel filter canister. When When disconnecting these fittings, remaining pressure will spill or even spray fuel. Be careful. The fuel pump disconnect should also be noted, and when working around the engine should be disconnected. On the right side of the engine compartment is the oil tank with its filler cap showing. Under the cap is a dipstick used to read the oil level. Also attached to the tank is the oil filter, which is hidden by the air conditioner compressor. Now, underneath the car, we have a better view of the oil tank and its drain plug. Again, the right heater box. In the center of the crankcase is an oil strainer plate and drain plug. This is the left side heater box. The left rear shock absorber, and high up inside the suspension is mounted the electric fuel pump. Back in the center of the car, we see the rear stabilizer bar, the front transmission mounts, and the transmission unit itself. Clutch free play at the pedal is adjusted by this cable. Finally, back to the right rear shock absorber. Looking up at the front end of the car, note the suspension, which consists of the disc brake caliper, the ball joint and the lower stabilizer assembly, the shock tower, the right end of the sway bar, and the tie rod end. The height adjustment of the front end is carried out by turning this bolt and jam nut. Basic maintenance. The alternator and air cooling fan are an integral unit. The fan belt will need some changing or adjusting from time to time. The spanner tool is used to hold the pulley while turning the alternator shaft nut counterclockwise. When loose, remove the spanner while holding the retaining collar and its washers. Remove each piece carefully to avoid dropping them. Now remove the old belt from under the crankshaft pulley. Once the new belt is properly seated in the lower pulley, hold it flat to the inside half of the upper pulley. Place half of the shims and the outer pulley half back onto the alternator shaft. Now replace the rest of the shims, the retaining collar, and finally the retaining nut. Proper tension is important. The belt should deflect about 10 millimeters or less than half an inch. To increase tension, remove shims from between the pulley halves. Accordingly, add shims to loosen. If too loose, the engine cooling and battery charging system will not function properly. If too tight, damage to the alternator bearing could result. Using the spanner and wrench, tighten the nut securely. Again, check for the proper tension. In order to check front wheel bearing free play, the wheel should be off the ground. Holding either the top or bottom of the wheel, rock it in and out. A slight amount of play should be felt, and the wheel should rotate freely. If adjustment is required, first remove the wheel and pry off the bearing dust cap. The split adjusting nut is released with the use of a 6mm Allen key. Rotate the nut counterclockwise or clockwise in order to feel the slightest drag. Roll the wheel hub to be sure it is not binding. Now tighten. If the hub is well greased, reinstall the dust cap. This is a good opportunity to check the brake pads. Check their thickness, the amount of material between the brake disc and the brake pad backing plate. 3 millimeters is a minimum. Finally, replace the wheel and its lug nuts. Changing the engine oil. There are 2 drain plugs, one on the bottom of the crankcase strainer plate and one on the bottom of the oil tank. Using a 19mm socket and a firm snapping motion, remove the oil tank plug. Hot oil is thin and hard to deal with under any circumstance. Have a drain pan ready and waiting. If the drain plug falls into the oil, don't rush to retrieve it. Plenty of time will be needed to allow the oil to drain free. The oil filter is clearly visible with the air conditioner compressor removed. Use an oil filter wrench to remove the filter. A thick rag will be helpful, as oil will pour from the filter base while turning. The new oil filter must have an adequate coating of oil applied to its rubber seal. Make sure the filter goes on straight and hand tighten only. The drain plug has a magnetic core and will catch any metallic material floating in the oil. This could represent potential engine problems. The drain plug seal should be renewed. Install the drain plug. Be sure to tighten firmly. Now, remove the strainer plate drain plug. This is usually adequate, but if sediment seems apparent, the entire strainer may have to be cleaned. Allow the oil to drain free. Again, check the drain plug and replace its seal. When tight, refill the tank with at least 10 quarts of oil. Do not top up the tank until the engine has been running for at least 2 minutes. The oil level must be checked while the engine is running. Due to expansion, the oil level will be higher when it is hot. This is the best time to add oil. There is a difference of 2 liters between the maximum and minimum lines on this dipstick. Tighten the cap firmly. On the left side of the transmission, note the transmission oil fill plug. The oil should be as high as the filler plug hole itself. If a problem is suspected, use the drain plug and examine its magnetic core. Large amounts of metallic filings can indicate abnormal transmission wear. Spark plugs and compression. The high-tension leads are connected to each plug by a long insulated resistor that must be snapped up and out from the spark plug. Use of a good quality spark plug socket, the type that holds onto the plug, is a must. Many people consider spark plug replacement as one of the most common and simplest of tasks. Don't overlook the importance of this step. It is the heart of engine combustion. Hastily applied force or improper replacement plugs can assure potential problems. Your plugs tell a story. Normal plugs will have an even textured tan to gray deposit. Worn plugs have small deposits and rounded electrodes. Carbon deposits indicated by a dry, sooty appearance show a rich fuel mixture or a weak ignition. And oil fouling shown by wet, oily plugs means that oil is leaking past worn valve guides or piston rings. With all of the spark plugs removed, we can now check the engine compression. To accomplish this, the compression gauge is now installed to each spark plug chamber one at a time. Do not over-tighten the gauge extension hose. Stay clear of the cooling fan and be sure at least one coil wire and the fuel pump plug are disconnected. Crank the motor over with the starter until the needle rises no further. Note the reading and proceed to the next cylinder. The readings on all compression gauges represent pounds per square inch developed during the compression stroke of each piston. They may vary as much as 15% from piston to piston. Most plugs available are pre-gapped, especially the platinum type. Be sure the plug threads are clean and install by hand as far as possible. Once seated, a half or three-quarter turn is needed to tighten the plug. Do not over-torque, as the head is made of aluminum and damage can occur. The wires are reinstalled using as little force as possible in order to snap onto the top of the plug. Timing your engine. The capacitive discharge, or CD, ignition system in this model consists of a conventional type of distributor and contact points located just to the left of the air intake. The cap and all connections must be free of dirt and moisture. Carefully release each hold-down clip and raise the cap straight up. It is hard to tell if any faults exist under the cap, but signs of common problems are moisture, dust deposits, pitted and burned electrodes, or hairline cracks. The center electrode is made of a soft graphite material and can easily be worn down or damaged. The rotor may show the same signs of deterioration, especially at the tip of the metal electrode. This rotor contains a rev limiter, which will ground the circuit in the case of excessive RPMs. The spring must be free and movable. The contact points are contained by a single screw and wire. To remove, loosen the hold-down screw, disconnect the positive wire lead, and lift the points up and out. The contact surfaces should have a clean, polished, and flat look. Make sure the distributor shaft and base plate are clean, and carefully lower a new set of points. Install the hold-down screw and tighten, but not completely. Now, plug the outer lead of the positive tab at the side of the distributor. Turning the crankshaft using a 22mm wrench and pinching the fan belt to provide tension, turn in a clockwise direction in order to place the high point of the distributor shaft cam against the rubbing block of the points. Notice the notch at the outer edge of the point base plate. Using a screwdriver in this notch, rotate the point plate to obtain the point gap. With a feeler gauge and screwdriver, reduce the gap until the slightest drag is felt upon withdrawal of the gauge tab. Tighten the contact plate screw at this point, and then recheck the gap. A very light patch of high-temperature point grease should be applied to the flat-cornered cam surface of the distributor shaft. The square notch at the top of the distributor shaft is to ensure that the rotor will be aligned. The cap also has a notch. There is only one way it can fit properly. Use of a dwell meter allows us to obtain a more accurate measurement with regards to the point gap. The gap actually represents the amount of time that the points are in the off position. When using a full 360-degree circle as a portion of the on position, this is called dwell. All dwell meters have a selection switch to match it with the number of cylinders. In this case, 6. And a multiple type meter should have the function switch set for dwell. Connect the meter ground lead to one of the mounting bolts. And connect the positive lead directly to the current supply terminal for the points. Again, loosen the points. Holding a screwdriver in the adjusting slot on the point plate, turn the engine over with the starter. You will notice that the dwell needle will change by rotating the point base. Adjust the needle as closely as possible to the proper dwell. See your owner's manual. Stop cranking the engine and tighten the adjusting screw. It should now be rechecked. Disconnect the dwell meter. And again, replace the rotor and the distributor cap. This is a good time to adjust the engine idle speed. The engine should be warm. Turn the air bypass screw clockwise to slow the engine or counterclockwise to increase the idle. Your correct speed should be illustrated on one of the decals at the edge of the fan housing. An accurate measurement of timing is using a strobe light. Find an adequate ground bolt for the negative lead of the strobe. Use the spark plug wire from cylinder number 1 for the signal lead and connect the red or positive lead to the top fuse on the left-hand fuse block. Be prepared to rotate the base of the distributor in order to change the timing while the engine is running. Using a 13mm socket with extension, slightly loosen the distributor base bolt. Clear the area around the fan and start the engine. Place the strobe light in position and notice first the cast reference mark at the base of the fan housing. The direction of rotation of the pulley is evident, and the flashing marks on the pulley appear to be still. Hold only the distributor base, not the cap. Carefully rotate in either direction and notice the pulley marks also move. Align the flashing pulley mark with the stationary reference mark on the fan housing. Now tighten the distributor base bolt. The timing, or the number of degrees from top dead center, has now been properly adjusted. Adjusting the valves. Notice the decals along the rear of the engine wall. They provide specific information for your year and model, including firing order and valve gap dimensions. Before proceeding, the air conditioner compressor must be partially disconnected in order to reach the right side intake valve cover. There are 2 bolts under the front and 1 under the rear of the compressor mounting plate. Also, loosen the sliding adjusting bolt. Lift off the air conditioner belt. Slide the compressor back and up, making sure the fittings are not damaged, and place it on a blanket or cloth to protect the car's paintwork. The valve covers can be removed, providing the engine oil has been fully drained. Loosen and remove the valve cover nuts and washers. Lift off the valve cover and remove all of the old gasket material. To adjust the valves in an orderly sequence, rotate the engine clockwise using a 22mm wrench to a point where cylinder number 1 is set up. At this point, Z1 on the pulley will be aligned with the timing mark on the fan housing. To be sure that you are on number 1, open the distributor cap and see that the rotor is pointing to electrode number 1. Locate the intake number 1, exhaust number 1, intake number 2, exhaust number 2, intake number 3, and exhaust number 3. We will be following the firing order sequence in adjusting the valves. This is located on the rear decal. Back off the adjusting screw jam nut on the number 1 intake valve and insert the special feeler gauge tool between the valve stem and the base of the valve rocker. It will seem difficult to find the exact spot at first. Turn or tighten the adjusting screw clockwise until the slightest drag is felt while rotating or sliding the gauge. Tighten the jam nut while holding the screw in place. Recheck to be sure the clearance hasn't changed. The same procedure is used to adjust the number 1 exhaust valve below. It is most important that exhaust valves in the 911 are not too tight. Check clearance repeatedly to be sure. Valve adjustment represents clearance between the camshaft and rocker surfaces and the valve stem. This gap ensures the proper seating for cooling and time period for a closed valve. When too tight, a valve could burn. Noisy and loose clearances will not let the engine breathe and could cause a considerable loss of power. When number 1 is complete, we rotate the motor by hand clockwise 120 degrees. This mark will represent valve rocker positioning for the next cylinder in the firing order sequence, number 6. After adjusting number 6 intake and exhaust, rotating 120 degrees to the next mark will allow us to adjust the number 2 valves. One more turn leaves us at Z1 again. Now adjust number 4 valves. Complete the sequence until all the valves have been adjusted. Valve clearance should not change much in under 12,000 miles. This is one way to determine the rate at which internal wear may be occurring. Clean and dry the valve cover mating surfaces and apply a new valve cover gasket. Make sure it is right side up. Clean and install the valve cover. It is important to install new squash washers and self-locking nuts. Use a tightening sequence from center to outermost nuts. Servicing the fuel system. Replacing the air filter is accomplished by releasing the two rubber straps at the top of the air intake. Lift off the outer half of the filter housing and pry the element to examine. Oil, condensation, burning, dust, and dirt warrant replacement. The new element fits tightly, so be sure it's fully seated and straight. To replace, simply reverse the previous procedures. The CIS, or constant injection system, is sophisticated but easy to understand. There is no way to maintain this system without special equipment or training. Do not work on it if you are a novice. When the throttle valve is opened, a rush of air flows toward each cylinder, causing a vacuum above the air sensor plate. This in turn causes the plate to rise. The opposite end of the sensor plate drops accordingly and allows fuel under high pressure to flow through metering slits in the fuel distributor to the injectors. The more throttle applied, the higher rate of airflow required for engine RPM, the higher the sensor plate. At full throttle, the fuel distributor side of the system would be allowing the maximum amount of fuel flow. At idle, the plate drops to a critically sensitive, adjustable height. This plate is responsible for power output, emission, and starting characteristics. It must be checked by a qualified person. Engine removal procedure. Use this section as a checklist for parts required to be disconnected in order to remove the engine. This job should be done only by the experienced Porsche owner. First, the battery needs to be disconnected. And in the engine compartment, remove the breather line, oil feeder line, the compressor, the two rear engine 19mm mounting bolts, the electrical gang plug, and the fuel line. There will be another electrical gang plug to disconnect once the engine is being lowered. Under the car, remove the lower and upper oil hoses, the axle, both right and left, the clutch linkage, the throttle linkage, and the sway bar. The front transmission mounts, both left and right, the speedometer cable up top, the ground strap, and the starter. In the car, remove the cover plate with 4 Phillips screws. Do not remove the forward bolt. This will throw the shift pattern linkage out of adjustment. Slide the shift boot back and, using the proper Allen key, remove the bolt and linkage. Congratulations! You've done it! The Intune series, produced by Video Vision Productions Incorporated, is dedicated to bringing you, the Porsche 911 enthusiast, a clear and organized procedure of preventive maintenance. Your greatest reward will be the self-satisfaction of a job well done. Enjoy and drive safe.